Hi again guys, and welcome to another Special Projects custom build, and we have visited the racing world when it comes to the Pagani Huayra before. We built a Huayra R fairly early on in this series, and we also kind of predicted beforehand what the Huayra BC could end up like, and actually the predictions which were made in that video weren't that far off from the real car and what it ended up being like. This one, though, is a category of vehicle which gets requested quite a bit, and that is GT3 Builds. What if there was a Huayra GT3 race car? Well, that's the purpose of this tune, to see not only can it be done, but also can it cut it as a GT3 car. Now, there are a couple of things which are down to personal preference in this build. Obviously, the colour of the car in particular is totally down to you. You could go for the single colour, you could go for the half and half carbon fibre two-tone. I personally have opted for the total bare carbon fibre look, and that comes with the car. It's actually the very bottom option in the dealership. So it depends if you want that or not. I wanted to go for kind of a test car look, like the stealth models, but as I said, it's totally down to personal preference. Now, as far as the rest of the visuals, we will run through those in the visual tuning garage. Then, of course, we'll run through the mechanical side of things, which is obviously more important for performance. And then finally, we'll take it out to Spa to see if it can cut it as a race car. Now, as far as aero upgrades go on this particular build, you've got a couple of options, a couple of different body kits, numerous wings to work with, so again, a lot of it is down to personal preference. The Type A body kit is considerably different. It's a little bit more understated than the Type B. The Type B, to me at least, looks more like an authentic race car style, so that's the one that I've gone for. But as I said, if you don't want to have that one, that's fine. As far as the flat floor, we don't have that option. It does already have a diffuser, but it would have been cool to give it a much bigger one, kind of Dodge Viper GTSR style. As far as the rear wing, I've gone for a custom wing. As you can see, I've gone for the Type E wing support, which is quite a minimalist design. Then I've gone for the Type D wing itself, which is a curved wing with the raised centre section. And then I've gone for the Type C winglets on the end, which again are quite minimalist. I wanted it to have a big, but also clean cut wing, nothing overly fancy, just to get the job done. Then as far as the size, I've gone for plus 15 on width, which is a similar kind of width to the car itself, and for height I've gone exactly 0, because if you make it too high or too low, it kind of starts to look silly. But again, it's down to what you personally want the car to look like. As far as the rims, I've gone for a chunky 5-spoke design, and it's actually these GT AB05s, very thick 5 spokes, in a similar kind of style to stuff like the Team RJN Nissan GTR GT3 machine, that big 5-spoke design. But again, it's down to what you personally want. I have changed the additional meters. I've gone for, as you can see, water temp and oil temp, totally down to you. And as far as the colour, as already mentioned, for the car itself, I went for the carbon fibre, total carbon fibre that comes with the model, but for the rims, obviously not. They're much darker, and for those who are maybe new to the channel, for the rims I went for glitched black, which many of you guys are familiar with now, but for those who don't know, that comes from the Peugeot Vision GT car. It's a solid colour, and I believe it comes from all of the colours on that model. I've gone for red number 764, and as you can see, that makes the rims solid black as opposed to the darker blacks or the more carbon effects, but it's just a total darkest black you can possibly get. And as far as the wing, I've left that in the stock colour, which is basically carbon, exactly the same as the body kit and the body of the car itself. So a very stealthy, base model kind of look to the vehicle. So that's it for the visuals. As you can see, I've also fitted the race plate. I opted not to have a number though. Again, test car kind of style. So all of that's down to you. There's plenty of room for variation there for personal preference. So now let's cover the mechanical side of things. Now, as far as the tune setup goes, and in particular with the specs on the car, you are of course running significantly less power than the car has to begin with. A lot of cars which are entered into various racing classes have to be, as you'd assume, upgraded to meet those regulations. Some, though, are already so quick that they actually have to be downgraded. Stuff like the TVR Speed 12 in the 90s had far less power as a race car than it did as the concept version or the road version. This car is similar in that regard, or at least in the way that I've built it. Now, with a GT3 car, you're looking at around 590 to 600 horsepower, generally, and as far as weight, around 1350 kilos, with a couple of exceptions. So that's what we've gone for. 600 horsepower, 1350 kilos, and as you can see, that nestles really nicely at the 600 pp level, which means that it's potentially quite useful for seasonals and online races as well. Now, I've gone for racing hards because you want that authentic racing look and racing feel, but at the same time don't want it to be too easy or too fast to drive. Well, not necessarily too fast, but some people consider it to be too easy. Again, it's down to personal preference. The brakes are already racing, but I would recommend braking earlier in this car than you would in a traditional GT3 car, because you've got so much power and speed to scrub off that you will need to brake earlier. It says they're racing brakes, but they don't feel as powerful as a traditional racing car's brakes would, even with the active aero. As far as suspension, we've got the lowest ride height front and rear. Springs have increased to 875 and 1225. The dampers quite a bit to 5. Anti-roll, likewise, we've increased to 4. We've got 1 degree of camber, and that's kind of for a twofold reason. One is because the Huayra can be a bit of a handful to drive, but at the same time we've got less power to deal with, and also for the look. Of course, race cars will often have a little bit of camber. Sometimes a GT3 car will have a bit more on the front end. I haven't opted for that with this vehicle, but again, if you want to do that, that's fine. Of course, it will change the handling up, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, based on personal preference. I've gone for neutral toe. We'll come back to the gearbox in just a second. As far as the diff, I've gone for halfway on initial torque, the lowest possible settings on both acceleration and braking. Again, as I always say, if you already know what works better for you, by all means go for that, or just feel free to mess around. Try and see if you can find something new that works for you. By all means, that's the point of these tunes. They're highly malleable to personal preference. As far as power, of course, 600 horsepower, as I said. We are running an oil change, so you need to bear that in mind. Then, I haven't fitted anything because you don't need it, especially when you're reducing the power as much as we are in this one. So reduce the power down to 78.3%. Now, technically, you can have a little bit more than that. As you can see, 603 horsepower will still stay under the 600 pp limit. Personally, I just wanted to round it off to 600 more for good-looking specs. So it's down to you. Kind of an OCD thing, maybe? I don't know, whatever. As far as downforce, we've got quite a bit. Given that it is a custom wing, that doesn't usually give you a good amount of downforce to work with, but on this car, it actually does. Now, I'd recommend stage 2 weight reduction, then the carbon bonnet, which doesn't really matter if it's body coloured or not because the car's carbon anyway, window weight reduction, and then 191 kilos of ballast, which, of course, brings us up to GT3 weight. Then I've opted to put that 32% towards the front. Not going for a 50-50 split, because I personally think that 50-50 is not the best split for a mid-engine rear-wheel drive car, but actually a 49-51 split is, in a similar way to a Le Mans prototype, which will often have around a 49-51 split. Having that little bit more weight on the back has a twofold benefit. One benefit is you have a little bit more traction on those back tyres, and the second benefit is by having a front end that's a little bit lighter, you can often have a better turn-in. But, of course, it's down to you. If you want to change that, by all means do so. As far as the gearbox, it's not a top speed build, but it still has a pretty decent amount of top-end performance. You're looking at around 200 on a long enough straight. As far as auto settings, I've gone for a 230 overall setting, then individual gears of 3.6, 2.4, 1775, 1375, 1125, 948 and 797, which in other words is all the way to the right, and then a final drive of 3.1, and of course you can adjust those as necessary. So that's it for the build. Now let's take it out on a racetrack to see if it can pull it off. Now, of course, despite the fact that we have heavily modified this car's handling, reduced its power load and its torque load significantly, and increased stuff like grip and downforce, you've still got to remember that this is a Huayra that you're dealing with, and in real life it's a good car, but on the game it does have notoriously slippery steering. And that is still present. If you push the car hard, if you give it full throttle out of a corner, it will still try to get its tail out. That being said though, it is much better through corners than you would typically expect a Huayra to be, and it definitely has the potential in seasonal events and in online races, as well as potentially career mode. Also, I've already used this car in seasonals, and although it's not going to dominate a tight circuit, for a track which allows a mix of both, such as here at Spa or Monza or potentially the Le Mans, places like that, it can prove pretty useful, especially given that at the end of the day, it is still a road car. So overall, if you do decide to use this build or some variation of it, obviously I hope you have a lot of fun with it and win plenty of races with it. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.